and take them from there to salvation. I mean, it's like they're going around and around and around Memphis, but they never get to go to Memphis because they just keep getting more and more information. It never takes them to the point where they obey the gospel. Well, we got to do better than that. Man, brethren across the country do. And the sad thing is, and of course it's personal stuff, but when he finished that 30 lesson set, they sent him a piece of paper and said, if you would like to study more, here's 2 addresses to contact. Creve Hall in Nashville, or Duluth, Georgia, and Truth for the World. Well, somebody over there, and I still don't know who it was, somebody over there had enough sense to send it over the mountain to me because he lives here in Sequatchie County, and so I go meet him, see. He said, why would I want to take a course from Nashville and I said, this is just exactly what need to happen. He said, well, obviously. Now, here's a non-Christian who sees the obvious, what ought to happen, then surely we can see the obvious instead of just keeping on stringing along a person and sending them, and never make contact with them to actually teach them one-on-one and lead them to. That's it. I mean, it's one of those things, well, that's what we've always done, well, this is what we've always done. Well, sometimes that's not good enough, And of course, I know how it is to be in a boiler shop and come up with a different way to do something, and people's been doing it the same way they've been doing it since before electricity was invented, and they're very, very mad at you if you come up with a different way that might be even a little bit easier. No, we don't. We've been doing this. I said, go ahead then. I guess that's one reason why it's shut down. Is they couldn't go any further than where they were back at the turn of the 19th century or the 20th century. So taking the people's account where they are, and that's one good thing about having this material or having the results of those correspondence courses this fellow did take, is because I know what he knows, or I know the way he answered those questions. So that goes a long way in making a determination as to what you do next. And so it's not the same as if you go in to a person cold and they don't know anything, and you don't know anything they do know, and so you have to start from scratch. But that's not the way it's been with this. And by the way, I'm having my 3rd study with him tomorrow, so keep that in your prayers too. It would really, really surprise me if he don't obey the gospel. Really would. So keep that in mind. So this just practical advice from these examples. And then notice number 12, which could have been the first one, but it's the last one. He always taught the truth, regardless of the audience or the possible consequences or responses that people might have. The disciples told Jesus in John chapter 6, don't you know that, no, excuse me, not John chapter 6, Matthew chapter 15. Don't you know that the Pharisees were upset with what you said? They were offended, Jesus. And what did Jesus say? Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't want. That's not what he said. He said, let them alone. They're blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind lead the blind, they're all going to fall in the ditch. Now, we are not in the position that Jesus is, in the sense that we knew what their heart was like. But Jesus was absolutely not concerned about upsetting the apple cart when it came to the religious leaders of the Jews, because they were in that position because they chose to be, and very few of them were going to change what they were doing and change what they were believing, because they were making money off what they were doing, even though it wasn't the truth. And that principle, of course, over in the 1st chapter of the book of 1 Corinthians applies, Not many mighty, not many noble, not many wise men after the flesh are called. In other words, if a person, it comes down to the rubber meeting the road where you have to admit you've been wrong for years, maybe even decades, then there's not a large percentage of people who are willing to do that. Now, all honest people are, But you know well as I that everybody's not honest. They do not follow the lead of the truth as they really should. So regardless. Now that doesn't mean that you jump square on their chest and start beating them over the head with the truth, obviously. But when you're in a position as Jesus was here, when you realize that you have people who are antagonistic to the truth anyhow, don't be so particular about tiptoeing around them lest you hurt their feelings, because they're the ones that contributed to a large multitude of people being lost by following their lead. And then the same principle over in Matthew chapter 23 is mentioned here. They compassed land and sea to make one proselyte, and when he was made, they made him twofold more the child of hell than themselves. In other words, they were real good at evangelizing, but they were evangelizing people their way of thinking instead of evangelizing people to the truth. Well, that needed to be recognized, and Jesus did his best to help them to see that. And you realize in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus is preparing his followers for after he's gone and having to deal with these guys. He wants them to know right up front that if they think that they can deal with them in the same way as the common people, it ain't going to happen. These are people that are dead set against the truth, and they will demonstrate that by seeing to it that those that teach the truth might have their mouths stopped one way or another, even if it means killing them. And that they did for sure. All right. Any comments? All right. Next, why did Jesus ask questions? Pretty simple. If you sat down and thought about it, you'd come up with every one of these answers. To cause people to think, to reason, to clarify an idea or a teaching. And of course, he had to do that numerous times with the Sabbath, didn't he? In the first century, to get people to respond or to get them involved in a discussion. What do you think about that? Is that the way you see it? To emphasize or draw attention to something, to remind his listeners about some matter, to cause people to be convinced in their hearts about a matter without him saying something directly, to motivate people to do the right thing, and to instruct and provide new instruction or new information that had not been previously provided. So all these are different ways that Jesus asked questions, and I submit that even without thinking, that should be the reason why we would ask questions as well. And of course, just about everything that we would ask, especially when we're talking about studying the scriptures with somebody, would fit into one of these categories for sure. And now here's where we're going to be benefited from this study, is not just memorizing the question that's asked, but knowing who it is that Jesus is asking this question of. That does matter, Here's a poor person, they run over to James chapter 5 and they say, there it is. Verse 16, confess your faults one to another, pray for one another, that you may be healed. The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. There it is, praying for salvation. That's what he says. Pray for one another that you may be healed. Confess and pray. Now the only problem with that is, who is this epistle directed to? Is it directed to those who've never obeyed the gospel? Telling them what to do to obey the gospel? No, it's addressed to Christians. It's addressed to members of the church. Well, does that make any difference? Well, obviously so. Makes a lot of difference. You can't take something that was said to a non-Christian and apply it to a Christian as to what's required of them, because two different things are required of them relative to forgiveness of sins. And then number two, what was the setting, or what's the circumstances surrounding the asking of this question? What had happened? Of course, this is where you have to take into consideration the context, because you can take a verse out of its context and it will appear somewhat strange dangling out there by itself. Well, you got to know the background for the question. Number three, what's the application of the question? And specifically for the person that he's asking the question of, what was he trying to accomplish with this question? And then here's where it matters for us. What application can you and I make from such a question? See? And that's where the true faith that we possess is demonstrated is in actually applying the principle that we find in these questions that Jesus asked. In the notation at the beginning of this list of questions, Roger says that if there's a question that's asked in Matthew, then he's not going to ask that question again, or he's not going to list it in the questions when he gets to Luke, because that question's already been asked and already been answered. So, but other than that, most of the questions he is, of course, addressing in here. And what we want to do is just look at these questions, look at the basis for the question, make an application to ourselves after we figure out the reason why Jesus did ask a question, and then go to the next one. I can't see it taking very long for us to go through quite a few each week, but it may be the case that we have to spend more time on some than others. It'll be primarily up to you. Any questions or comments before we go further?
I get what you're talking about giving people time and keep continuing on. But Jesus said, I raised his time. Don't you understand it? You know, after he said, they didn't understand it, said 5,000, he got frustrated. You know, there's a point that you got to get there.
Yeah, exactly. Patience is a virtue. Long suffering is truly a virtue, but continued allowance for inactivity is not a virtue. You know, I mean, you read there in Acts chapter 1, obviously, after Jesus has been resurrected from the dead and prior to his ascension back into heaven, and here's the apostles saying, Lord, are you going to at this time restore the kingdom? And of course, if I'd have been Jesus, I'd have flew off the handle right there. You got to be kidding me. And of course, Jesus said, have I been with you all this time and you don't know better than to ask a question like that? It's not for you to know. It's not for you to know. In other words, and then right after that, I'm sure he's thinking, boy, I'm glad we're not leaving it up to them to put this sermon together for the church to be established in Acts chapter 2. I'm glad the Holy Spirit's going to be writing this sermon, and they're just going to be delivering it. Because it's left up to him, ain't no telling what it'll be. See? They haven't got it yet. See? They were still, even after 3 years of hearing Jesus say, my kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is not of this world. Then they said, his kingdom is of this world. So if they, in such close proximity to Jesus for that many years, and for that amount of time were slow to pick up on it, then, and Jesus didn't strike them dead right there on the spot, then he's a whole lot more patient than I am, and which means we need to be more patient, I guess. But in a
Years, probably what, maybe 25, 30 years, they've been calling the Messiah was going to come to establish kingdom of America.
yeah,
So Jesus, even though he was who he was and taught him and they lived with him, 3 years apparently wasn't long enough for them to get it.
no,
And so that preconceived ideas and what you've been taught all those years makes a difference. That's why when we approach people and talk to people, we can't expect them just to say, oh yeah, I
Yeah.
get it.
exactly.
That's not the way it works.
No. Now, they did not learn error in a short period of time, and you're not going to be able to unteach them out of that error in a short period of time, most of the time. And you still find people even that you would think would know better, that still there are various aspects of sectarian error that they still use by way of the way they talk and stuff even today. And it's so deeply ingrained in there that it's hard to eradicate. But it needs to be, obviously, so that the truth will have a place to reside. All right. We had in our devotional reading, and of course a bunch of these are going to be from the same context, these first questions. And in our devotional reading, that composes a part of what? What is the 5th, 6th, and 7th chapters of the book of Matthew referred to as? The Sermon on the Mount, okay? Here is the sermon that Jesus taught. This is the only time that in its entirety it's recorded, but different aspects of this same message is recorded at other times throughout Luke and Mark. And as I've oftentimes said, based upon the beginning of this lesson, what Jesus is doing is he is dealing with the type of characteristics that will exist among those who are, in the very near future, becoming citizens in the kingdom of God. You know, here are some qualities and characteristics that God's followers will have when they become members of the Lord's church, when they're added by the Lord to his church, when they enjoy the forgiveness of sins, when they start following in the footsteps of Jesus. Here are the qualities and characteristics that they will possess, okay? And so the last one, of course, there in verse 10, blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my name's sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. All right, now we usually say, all right, there's the end of the Beatitudes, but the concept doesn't change when he begins in verse 13. When he says, ye are the salt of the earth, they at that time weren't, okay? They weren't the salt of the earth. They're going to learn what that means, and they're going to become the salt of the earth. But at the time that that sermon is being preached, they are not yet that. And all of those that are assembled that day, I dare say, are not ever going to be the salt of the earth. There will be a percentage of them that are. The apostles in the crowd will ultimately be, except for Judas, you know. But here is a standard that God is setting up for those who are going to compose the kingdom. And it's a matter of individuals' choice to have these qualities a part of them as they become a part of God's eternal kingdom, okay? It's still within their realm of ability to reject it entirely, you know, and only get interested in Jesus when they're being fed. You know, I guarantee there was people like that. Is that Jesus fella coming around any? I ain't had a good meal in a long time. Maybe he'll feed 5,000 today. I could sure use some fish and some bread, you know. But that's the foundation. So when he gets here and he says, you are the salt of the earth, what is he talking about? All right. The idea, there's a number of different qualities that are associated with salt. The one that this generation, exclusive of John's generation, would think about would not be in the preserving of meat, obviously, but it'd be in the flavoring of whatever it is. Green beans. Can you imagine eating green beans without no flavoring, without no salt? I couldn't imagine. You know. So there's the flavoring aspect, which makes it more palatable to eat something that tastes a whole lot better when it's got salt on it. There's the preservative nature of it. There's also the ability that salt has to make you thirsty, okay? Now that's an aspect of it that might be somewhat of a stretch, but if here's a person, realistically, here's a person who is shining as the light of the world, you know, he's exemplifying Jesus in his life, then that's supposed to make other people thirsty for what that person enjoys, okay? There's also, and one of the question that Jesus asked here is if the salt does what? That it's not going to be worth anything. It loses its flavor. It loses its saltiness. Now I've read, and of course I can't testify to this being accurate or not, but I've read that in some places where there are huge deposits of salt, that when it's exposed to the elements of the world, then it looks like salt, you know, has the quality of salt, but there ain't no salt in it. It loses its saltiness.
Doesn't make a difference anymore.
No,
Doesn't affect anything.
doesn't do anything. But it is good for graveling your driveway, you know. It can be used for that, see? And that's the very illustration that he uses here. If it doesn't have its salty characteristic, then it's good for nothing but to be used for fixing your driveway when the water washes it out or something. Yeah, that's all it's good for. And then I also read, and this supposedly was illustrated in some foreign country over in the Middle East, is that the closer that the salt deposit was to rock, the more it retained its saltiness, in spite of the elements that were affecting it. Well, you know, that sounds like a real good illustration used in a sermon. Whether it's accurate or not, I don't know. Because if you're thinking about the rock upon which Jesus was established the church, you know, that he's the Son of God, then obviously the greater ability to influence the world as salt influences the world would come from the closer in proximity we are to the Christ, okay? Now, while that's accurate or not and actually exists, I've not done any digging to verify that to be the case, but there's a possibility that is it. And that would simply be from a protection from the elements where maybe it would not have all those things leaked out of it or absorbed out of it as time went on. So when he says this, if you're not this type of individual that is affecting the world in a positive way, seasoning the world, preserving the world, contributing to the salvation of the world, then what are you doing? You know, have you ever heard of somebody just referred to as taking up space? You know, now, that happens in school sometimes, you know. Somebody's got the best seat in the room, but they're not using that best seat to learn anything. They're just taking up space, you know. Well, as it relates to applying this principle, that can actually happen, you know. When Jesus says it's good for nothing, well, it is good for building a road, but compared to what it's supposed to be able to do, that's good for nothing, you know. Just about anything can be used for that, see. So when Jesus uses this, as he begins this application of what he's already established here, you can see how he's already getting somewhat pointed in saying, you know, all these qualities and characteristics, the meek, the pure in heart, those that mourn and all that. There's also the application of influencing the world for good, which means there has to be some contact between the salt and the world, or else you can't do any influencing. Now, how in the world those people in ancient times thought that true spirituality could only be gained by going and living in a cave somewhere, you know, or in a monastery somewhere, you know, and refuse all type of creature comforts, including baths and shavers, you know, that somehow contributed to a higher spiritual status. How could they come to that conclusion from a simple to understand passage like this? I don't know. But they did, you know. And some of the supposedly the sharpest minds that have ever lived throughout the history of quote-unquote Christianity, then they came to that conclusion erroneously so, and could not influence the world for good if they did not have any contact at all with the world. If you follow the example of Jesus, did Jesus influence the world as salt? Well, sure. How did he do it? The only way you can. There has to be contact with the world in order to do that. Why is your master eating and drinking with publicans and sinners? Obviously, he's not the Son of God, is what the religious leaders of the Jews said. But in reality, he was demonstrating that he was the Son of God by doing what he was doing. He was interacting with the world and trying to interact with the world to the point that he would influence that part of the world that the religious elite wouldn't have anything to do with. He would influence them for the good and for their ultimate salvation. Couldn't do that if you never made contact. Couldn't do it. I know, well, I'm not going to say it. Anything else on this particular question? Absolutely. Yeah, the medicinal use of salt. I even read here not too long ago. I didn't go any further in the article than just the title, but it said, "Pour salt down your drain every now and then." Did anybody read the rest of that story? I never did figure out why. Yeah. Ah. Well, I didn't realize that. Now, that's another reason to eat it, so you don't have any roots in your system. So, medicinal use of salt, therapeutic value in salt, you know. I mean, isn't Epsom salt salt, you know? And I think there's some soap that's in my shower that's got Epsom salt in it, you know. Put salt in their eyes. Man, I'm glad I'm not a cattle. That'd be awful painful. So there's all these characteristics of salt that are for the betterment of humanity. But in order for that betterment to take place, there has to be the contact. And that's another story altogether too. In order for there to be contact, then there has to be an intermingling with that might not be, you know, what was the terminology? Some people say you need to get out of your comfort zone, you know. I could take you some places that if they still exist, where you'd probably have to have somebody hold a gun on you before you'd even go in the room. 500 flies swarming and 500 on the tables. And the smell, I can smell it to this day. But there was 12 little old kids from 14-year-old down to a baby in that house, along with various aunts and uncles that had a soul, of all things. And have you ever sat down somewhere and not actually sat down? Got real close? Yeah. Thank y'all so much. We'll pick up here on question number 2, Lord willing, on Wednesday evening. Absolutely. Yeah, I've dug into a hound before that I guarantee was 20 years old, but he got down in there far enough, there's good food in there.